"We're cutting unnecessary drag," Grant Wexler said, tapping the table. "And you're the drag." The word drag landed harder than the termination notice itself. It wasn't performance. It wasn't misconduct. It was speed. He said the company needed to move faster, lighter, louder, and that I slowed things down by insisting on controls, reviews, and signatures. Then he laughed, not nervous, not awkward, a clean, confident laugh, shared with the board as if they were in on the joke. "Relax, Dylan. Governance people always think they matter more than they do." I felt the irritation rise and lock itself behind my ribs. I didn't defend my record. I didn't list the crises that never happened because I stopped them. I asked one question, evenly, professionally. Was the termination final? He nodded without looking up. Already stacking papers. Already done with me. For 9 years. My role had been simple and thankless build systems that kept ambition from turning into liability. I designed voting frameworks, compliance triggers, and risk controls so executives could act without blowing holes in the company later. Grant's role was different. He believed authority came from confidence, not caution, from motion, not structure. He called hesitation weakness and documentation dead weight. Around the table, no one met my eyes. The general counsel studied her notes like they had suddenly changed. The board chair adjusted his glasses and stared at nothing. Silence filled the gaps where responsibility should have been. Grant stood, still smiling. "This isn't personal," he said, which was how I knew it was. My access pinged off in polite, bloodless increments. He enjoyed that too, the clean break, the visible control. I gathered nothing. I didn't need to. The systems I built didn't live on my laptop. They lived in the company's spine as people filed out. The general counsel paused beside me. Her voice dropped to a whisper. Tight and precise. "The conditional voting appendix," she said, "has just been triggered." That was when the laughter finally stopped. No one clapped, no one spoke, and the room suddenly understood consequences move faster than applause alone now. "I hope you and the people you love are doing okay today. Maybe take a moment later to check in on someone at home, share a meal, make a call, or just sit together without the noise. I'm curious, where are you listening from right now? Stay with me, and if this story speaks to you, consider subscribing because what happens next is where the balance really begins to shift. I learned early that quiet work leaves no fingerprints for years. I stayed behind the curtain, repairing damage before it became a headline. When executives rushed decisions through half-read memos, I rewrote voting procedures overnight when numbers were approved without quorum. I found lawful delays when enthusiasm threatened compliance. I slowed it down until it looked like discipline instead of panic. Most people never noticed. That was the point. I absorbed pressure so the company could look confident in public. I corrected reckless approvals, resequenced agendas, and documented exceptions no one wanted remembered. Every fix bought time. Every delay prevented a mess someone else would have blamed on markets or bad luck. Grant Wexler never liked that kind of work. He liked motion. He liked applause. He said it plainly, often enough for it to stick. Paperwork slows winners down. He repeated it whenever I raised concerns, smiling as if speed were proof of intelligence. To him, controls were obstacles. To me, they were the only reason momentum didn't turn into collapse. I was gradually removed from decisions that mattered. Strategy meetings happened without me. Final votes were scheduled while I was traveling, yet when something cracked, my phone rang. Late nights. Early mornings, quiet requests to fix what had already gone wrong. I was invisible when credit was given, essential when consequences arrived. That imbalance settled into me. I carried it without complaint. Believing restraint was part of the job, I told myself stability mattered more than recognition. Still, frustration accumulated, layer by layer, like pressure behind reinforced glass. I watched shortcuts become habits, and habits become policy. One memory surfaced after the laughter faded. Years earlier, during a volatile transition, The board chair had asked me to stay late. No speeches, no ceremony, just a document slid across the table. It granted me a temporary voting proxy, conditional and narrow, designed as a safety valve if leadership ever moved too fast. He called it precaution, not power. I signed, filed it, and forgot it, assuming it would expire unused. Sitting there now, recalling that night, I understood something important. Quiet systems don't disappear. They wait, and over those years. Waiting taught me patience, endurance, and the cost of silence. Lessons I never intended to use but carried forward, accumulating quietly, until circumstance, timing, and someone else's arrogance finally demanded they be applied without apology or hesitation. I didn't feel anger when the termination finalized. I felt clarity. Systems don't react emotionally, they execute. The moment my status changed, procedures I designed years ago moved without asking permission. No alerts sounded, no announcements were made. The mechanism simply shifted, precise and indifferent, the way well-built governance always does. I didn't request authority. I didn't send emails or raise my voice. The conditional framework transferred voting weight automatically, exactly as written, exactly as approved. 75% of temporary voting power rebalanced itself away from impulse and toward control. Not because I wanted it, but because the company had once decided it needed protection from moments like this. Grant laughed when the board hesitated. He waved a hand and called it technical nonsense, the kind of detail lawyers obsess over to feel important. He spoke louder, faster, pushing momentum as if volume could rewrite contracts. I watched him perform confidence, mistaking noise for command. While the system finished what it had been built to do, the board tried to respond. Motions were proposed. A vote was called to suspend the transfer before it became inconvenient. Papers were passed, screens refreshed, then confusion set in, subtle at first, then unmistakable. The numbers didn't add up, hands raised, then lowered again. The math refused to cooperate. No one looked at me. They looked at each other. The realization moved across the table slowly, like a shadow at the edge of vision. Without the conditional block, they would have had the votes. With it active, they didn't. The margin they needed no longer existed. Grant demanded clarification. He accused procedure of betrayal. He insisted authority couldn't vanish because one employee was dismissed. I said nothing. Control doesn't argue, it waits. The general counsel cleared her throat and confirmed what the figures already showed. The vote could not pass. In that moment, the room cooled. The laughter drained out, replaced by calculation. They understood what speed had overlooked. Power hadn't changed hands dramatically. It had followed instructions written long before personalities mattered. I didn't win anything. I simply stood where the structure placed me. The meeting adjourned without resolution. Decisions stalled. Grant's certainty fractured into irritation. I gathered my jacket. Steady, unhurried. The system was now in balance, temporarily, deliberately. 75% wasn't leverage. It was a pause button, and for the first time since the quiet years began. I was no longer reacting. I was holding. That control felt impersonal, almost merciful. It removed emotion from the equation and replaced it with boundaries everyone had previously accepted. Nothing dramatic happened yet, and that restraint was the point. Pressure settled, options narrowed, and every reckless path closed quietly, leaving only deliberate choices ahead. I stayed calm, knowing the next move would belong to time, documentation, and consequence alone and final. If you leave here, you will miss the most important thing. The number 48 hovered over everything, invisible but heavy, pressing decisions into narrower corridors with every passing hour. The clause was precise. The conditional authority expired unless certain behaviors extended it. I didn't rush. I sequenced first. I froze strategic decisions already scheduled for approval, citing risk alignment reviews that had always existed. Second, I delayed contracts carrying asymmetric downside, invoking cooling-off provisions the board had previously endorsed. Third, I blocked appointments tied personally to Grant, requiring independent vetting under conflict standards he had dismissed as ceremonial. None of it was dramatic. All of it was lawful. Time tightened. Grant noticed the slowdown and responded with threats, not analysis. He promised lawsuits, personal exposure, and reputational damage if I didn't reverse course immediately. Emails multiplied, calls escalated, pressure became a metronome, counting down the hours. I stayed procedural. Threats don't speed systems, they expose intent. The good faith obligation was clear, and his messages crossed it repeatedly. Each threat logged itself as evidence, extending the very authority he wanted extinguished. The General Counsel confirmed the effect without commentary. 48 hours stopped shrinking and started stretching. Grant's tone changed from bravado to urgency. Mine remained level, because countdowns favor those who plan for them. By nightfall, approvals were paused, risks documented, and pathways narrowed. The board began to understand that intimidation had backfired. The clock still ticked, but it now worked for restraint, not panic. I didn't need all the time, just enough to force deliberate choices. That was the design. Every threat added minutes, every minute closed reckless exits. Control wasn't loud, but it was cumulative. As the window held open, consequences queued patiently. I felt the pressure, constant and precise, yet the structure absorbed it better than any argument could. This was the work I had done for years, now applied to the room that doubted it. Grant kept pushing, insisting authority should bend to urgency. The document said otherwise, calmly, consistently, by morning. The extension was undeniable, a direct result of his own tactics. The 48-hour threat had transformed into a controlled pause. I transitioned from reacting to directing constraints, one measured action at a time. The pressure didn't vanish, it aligned. That alignment changed everything. What followed would test resolve, not volume, and reward discipline over bravado. The countdown remained. But the advantage had shifted. I held the line, knowing time now answered to the rules we had written. With each recorded misstep, the framework tightened, patient and exact. Grant's objections lost force as compliance gained weight. The hours passed, heavy but orderly. I prepared for the next phase, where pressure would meet consequence. The pause had done its job, and the system waited for the board to choose. Their choice would define what speed meant here today, forward for everyone involved. The split didn't happen all at once. It crept in through side conversations, revised agendas, and emails forwarded too many times. By the time the board convened again, tension had replaced confidence. People arrived early, left phones face down, and chose seats like alliances mattered. Grant sensed it immediately and tried to dominate the room with speed, interrupting questions, reframing votes, pushing closure before doubt could settle. I wasn't there. That absence was deliberate instead of my chair. They had my words, delivered through formal memoranda and procedural notices. Each document was calm, sourced, and time-stamped. It reminded them that authority could operate without theatrics. The more Grant argued, the quieter the papers became, and the louder their effect grew. The board fractured into clear lines. One side wanted momentum restored at any cost. The other wanted containment, review, and breathing room. Grant accused hesitation of sabotage and loyalty of weakness. He demanded an immediate vote to override constraints. The motion stalled. Questions surfaced. Requests for clarification multiplied. Control slipped from his tone first, then from his timing. Messages pinged my phone as the meeting dragged on. I didn't respond. My silence wasn't defiance, it was compliance. Everything I needed to say was already logged. Every attempt to rush now created more record, more friction, more proof that restraint was necessary. Grant's frustration escalated. He stood, paced, and appealed to urgency like it was a legal standard. It wasn't. The chair struggled to keep order. Side discussions broke out. The room felt crowded with unfinished sentences and competing assumptions. Chaos didn't explode, it thickened. Then something shifted. A board member who had defended Grant publicly asked to speak. The request landed heavily. He explained carefully that support depended on discipline, not volume. He withdrew his backing, citing governance risk and exposure. The words were polite, the effect was not. Grant froze. The count changed. The margin disappeared. No vote could save him now. The meeting adjourned abruptly, unresolved and raw. I received the minutes later, neutral in language, devastating in implication. I reviewed the sequence late that night, noting where alliances cracked and where fear surfaced. Nothing needed correction yet. The split itself was leverage enough. Boards reveal priorities under pressure, and this one had done exactly that. Tomorrow would bring demands, spin, and proposals. For now, disorder had done its work, exposing who could adapt when certainty vanished. Process moved exactly as originally designed. If you're someone who looks deeper than most, don't leave, this next part is for you. The hearing began without ceremony, which felt appropriate. Justice rarely announces itself. It assembles quietly from records and restraint. I took my seat along the wall, present but not central, letting the process speak in my place. The agenda was narrow and procedural, yet the air carried consequence. Everyone knew this was no longer about personalities. It was about whether rules meant anything when pressure arrived. The General Counsel opened with documents, not opinions. She walked the board through decisions approved without quorum, timelines compressed beyond policy, and delegations issued without safeguards. Each item stood alone, modest, defensible, until placed beside the next. Together they formed a pattern of haste, masquerading as leadership. No one interrupted. Notes replaced whispers. The room learned to listen again. Grant tried to reclaim momentum early. He framed urgency as vision and dismissal as decisiveness. When questions followed, his answers circled outcomes while avoiding methods. Emails surfaced, showing warnings acknowledged and ignored. Risk memos returned, stamped received. He called them conservative. The documents called them prescient. Authority looked smaller when measured against its own signatures. As the sequence continued, something steadier emerged. Accountability stopped feeling abstract. The board asked when thresholds were crossed, who approved exceptions, and why controls were bypassed repeatedly. Grant's explanations shortened. Confidence thinned. The posture of command gave way to defense. I said little, clarifying only process when asked, because facts were already doing the work. A recess was called. I stood, stretched, and waited. When we reconvened, the chair summarized findings without drama. The violations were not spectacular, they were cumulative. Abuse of discretion, repeated disregard for warnings, exposure created knowingly. The words were plain, almost gentle, which made them heavier. The motion arrived, measured and lawful suspend executive authority pending remediation. Grant objected loudly, predicting chaos. The prediction landed flat. The board understood chaos had already been invited, and restraint was the antidote. Ballots were distributed, pens moved. The count was taken twice. The result was decisive. Authority was removed, effective immediately. No applause followed. Relief did not either. What settled instead was alignment. Process had caught up to behavior. I felt the pressure release, not as triumph, but as correctness restored. I remained careful not to celebrate, because celebration invites reversal. The decision required execution plans, interim controls, and communication discipline. I drafted transition steps, escalation paths, and reporting cadence, keeping language neutral and time-bound. The board approved implementation parameters the same afternoon. That quiet approval mattered. It meant oversight would persist after headlines faded, and that authority would be exercised through documented limits rather than personalities. Across teams, compliance returned as habit, not obstacle, reinforcing trust. As the meeting closed, I gathered my notes. The system had advanced one step, exactly as intended. Justice did not rush, it formed, vote by vote, until motion became consequence. Grant refused to disappear quietly. The morning after authority was stripped, his statements flooded inboxes and feeds, polished and aggressive. "This is a hostile takeover by bureaucracy," he told reporters, framing restraint as sabotage. He demanded loyalty, promised speed, and warned of collapse. The noise was intentional. He believed volume could restore gravity. Media attention followed him, not the facts. Panels debated leadership style while filings waited patiently. I watched coverage with distance, satisfied but measured. Control is not celebration. It is containment, internally. Teams paused launches, reviewed guidance, and held position, externally. The image of the fearless reformer began to crack. Documents leaked, then circulated. Timelines showed rushed approvals. Emails revealed warnings brushed aside. Grant pushed back, calling them selective and outdated. "We move fast," he said on camera. "That's how winners win." The phrase aged poorly. Each replay narrowed his defense, because speed without method had finally produced consequences everyone could see. Pressure mounted. Sponsors asked questions. Partners sought assurances. The board issued brief updates, factual and dry, refusing to spar. Grant escalated, threatening litigation and naming enemies. "I won't be sidelined by paper," he said, repeating the line that once earned laughs. This time, it landed as arrogance. I felt the satisfaction arrive, controlled and cool, not because he suffered, but because the system held. The narrative shifted from vision to risk. From charisma to exposure, his brand collapsed under its own claims, undone by receipts. Then the contract spoke. Buried in compensation language was a clawback tied to misconduct and governance failure. The trigger had been crossed during the hearing, validated by findings, automatic and unemotional. Finance notified him the same afternoon. Bonuses froze, equity awards reversed. The promise of upside vanished into accounting entries. Grant responded with disbelief. "You can't take what I earned," he argued, as if effort outweighed obligation. Counsel replied in writing, citing sections, dates, votes. The math prevailed. By evening, the story changed again. Headlines moved from reform to reckoning. I didn't comment publicly. I didn't need to. The fall wasn't personal. It was procedural. Satisfaction stayed contained, anchored to fairness. When applause finally came, it was quiet, internal, and brief. What mattered was precedent restored, boundaries enforced, and a lesson delivered without shouting. I closed the file and set reminders for audits, communications, and interim oversight. There would be appeals, interviews, and attempts to rewrite the timeline. None of that worried me. Process favors patience. We documented everything, scheduled reviews, and assigned accountability without theatrics. The company would move slower for a moment, then steadier. That steadiness was the real reform, and it would outlast any headline. It also reminded leaders that authority survives only when restraint is respected, consequences are accepted, and governance remains boring enough to work every ordinary day, without spectacle, excuses, shortcuts, ego, or convenient amnesia. The clawback moved faster than rumor. Finance didn't dramatize it, they executed. Bonuses were reversed, deferred compensation reclassified, benefits suspended pending review. Lines changed on spreadsheets, signatures followed, and leverage evaporated. Cold precision replaced outrage, which was exactly how it was supposed to work. I stayed focused on sequence. First, the board formalized removal of Grant from his seat, citing governance failure and loss of fiduciary trust. Second, an independent review team was appointed to audit decisions made during his tenure. Third, communications went out, factual and restrained, signaling stability rather than spectacle. No speeches, no victory laps. Grant protested in writing, demanding reinstatement and threatening damages. His tone shifted from defiant to accusatory, then to legalistic. None of it altered the process. Each benefit he claimed was cross-checked against clauses he had signed. Each incentive depended on standards he had ignored. Precision is persuasive when language fails. The review uncovered predictable patterns, accelerated approvals without quorum, exceptions stacked on exceptions. Risk warnings acknowledged and overridden, individually. Each choice could be defended, together. They described a system bent toward speed at the expense of duty. Findings were summarized, shared with regulators where required, and archived. Accountability does not need drama to be permanent. By afternoon, Grant's name was removed from the board roster. Calendars updated, access expired. The building did not notice. Organizations rarely do. What they notice is friction disappearing when the right constraints return. Then came the lawsuit. Grant filed quickly, seeking emergency relief, claiming retaliation and overreach. The filing read like a press release. Our response read like a manual. Dates, sections, votes, precedent. The judge denied the motion at the first hearing, noting the contract's clarity and the board's documented authority. The loss was immediate and procedural. I felt no surge of triumph, only confirmation. Cold outcomes don't require celebration. They require accuracy. We updated timelines, briefed teams, and continued the audit. The company moved forward under interim leadership, quieter now, but safer. As evening settled, I closed the file and scheduled follow-ups. Precision had done its work. Not revenge, not theater, just enforcement. When rules are written carefully, they end arguments early. Grant's case would linger in headlines for a day or two, then fade. The controls would remain, exact and indifferent, doing what they were built to do, long after personalities stopped mattering. That indifference was the point. Systems correct behavior, not feelings. I documented next steps, set reporting intervals, and assigned owners without names attached. Work resumed under constraints everyone had approved. The lesson was simple. Enforced without malice, governance protects companies when leaders forget to protect themselves, and consequences arrive calmly, measured, inevitable, fair, durable, repeatable, unemotional, exact, final. Enough. I was invited back quietly. The way corrections usually happen, no press, no applause, just a call asking whether I would return with expanded authority. The offer was generous, layered with titles and assurances, an attempt to close the chapter quickly. I listened, thanked them, and asked for time, because silence deserves consideration. When we met, the room felt different, less defensive, more attentive. Power had loosened its grip. They spoke about continuity, trust, and confidence. Someone mentioned the CEO role, carefully, as if placing a fragile object on the table. I declined without hesitation. I had no interest in occupying the chair that had distorted judgment. Authority should be constrained, not celebrated. What I wanted was simpler and harder. Restore the governance framework as written. Reinstall independent reviews, clear thresholds, and escalation paths that do not bend under pressure. Define limits executives cannot cross, even when speed is tempting and applause is nearby. Fair systems don't rely on good intentions, they rely on structure. The board listened, questions followed, practical and specific. How would oversight work? Who would decide when urgency justified exception? I answered with process, not promises, timelines, documentation, and accountability matrices, justice in organizations. Is consistency applied over time? As the discussion settled, a quiet clarity emerged. They expected a victor's demand. Instead, they received boundaries. The silence felt earned, not awkward. It carried relief. I sensed acceptance replacing anxiety, a recognition that stability mattered more than pride. Then I offered something unexpected. I proposed an interim CEO with no allegiance to any board faction, someone operationally competent and temperamentally neutral. Not a savior, not a reformer, just a steward, The suggestion reframed the room. It shifted focus from personalities to continuity. There was hesitation, then agreement. A neutral leader would buy time, rebuild trust, and prevent old habits from returning under a new name. The vote passed easily. Balance favored restraint. When the meeting ended, no one rushed out. We lingered, exchanging measured nods. Outside, the company continued working, unaware of the recalibration underway. That anonymity felt right. I left without ceremony. Fairness rarely announces itself. It restores proportions and lets people breathe. The silence that followed was not emptiness, it was alignment, and for the first time since the laughter, I felt the system settle into place, not triumphant, just correct. That outcome mattered more than titles ever could. It protected employees, investors, and decisions yet to be made. Calm replaced fear, rules replaced moods. I understood then that justice, when it works, sounds like nothing at all, and leaves behind a company able to move forward without flinching, noise, or borrowed confidence, earned through patience, discipline, accountability, restraint, and time, applied consistently everywhere. I watched the company settle back into its rhythm, not with celebration, but with relief. Operations resumed quietly. Approvals followed structure, and decisions moved without panic or spectacle. The interim leadership kept meetings short, documentation clear, and accountability visible, which was exactly the point. Stability returned not because anyone won, but because boundaries were respected again. There were no press releases, no portraits, no victory laps. Credit dispersed across teams who did the work while the noise faded. I stayed in my role, focused on maintenance, audits, and escalation paths, letting the framework speak for itself. That restraint was intentional, because systems survive only when they are boring enough to trust. Grant Wexler vanished from the industry with surprising speed, his interviews stopping, his invitations ending, his certainty evaporating into quiet footnotes. People stopped asking about him, which is the final measure of consequence. Markets adjusted, employees relaxed, and partners regained confidence without needing a villain or a hero. The work continued, and that continuity felt earned, not forced. I reviewed controls, closed findings, and scheduled future reviews, satisfied by alignment rather than applause. Justice had arrived without drama. Shaped by votes, clauses, and patience, it was clear, fair, and durable, which is all governance should ever promise. When colleagues thanked me, I redirected the credit, reminding them that rules matter more than personalities. Balance is not a feeling. It is a condition maintained daily. As the weeks passed, the company moved forward with confidence grounded in limits, not bravado. I kept my head down, satisfied by the absence of crisis, the lesson held quietly. Authority must answer to structure, and structure must answer to time, in the end. Nothing dramatic remained, only fairness doing its job. What mattered was that the company learned without being humiliated, corrected itself without collapsing, and proved that governance is not an obstacle to progress, but the reason progress lasts beyond one personality or season of applause. Ensuring trust, continuity, and protection for people who show up every day expecting fairness instead of spectacle. Fear, shortcuts, ego, excuses, noise, confusion, bravado, improvisation, favoritism, panic, shortcuts, risk, drama, mistakes, repetition, excess. He laughed when he fired me. The system didn't laugh when it corrected him. I didn't win because I was louder, smarter, or more ruthless. I won because I stayed long enough to understand how quiet work actually holds a place together. Living through this taught me something practical and human. At the same time, real power isn't about control over people. It's about responsibility for consequences. When you choose restraint, you carry weight silently. When you choose ego, the weight eventually crushes you. What stayed with me wasn't the downfall of one person, but the moment balance returned, the room felt lighter. People spoke more honestly. Decisions slowed just enough to become thoughtful again. That's when I realized justice doesn't always feel explosive. Sometimes it feels like breathing normally after holding your breath for years. If you've ever stayed quiet to protect your family, your team, or your own dignity, you know how heavy that silence can be. And if you stayed with this story until the end, I hope it reminded you that patience isn't weakness, it's preparation. When this finishes, do one small thing for your health. Stand up, stretch your shoulders, take a slow breath, or sip some water. You've earned that pause. By the way, are you listening from home, from work, or somewhere unexpected? Let me know in the comments. I read them. If this story resonated, please leave a like, share it with someone who needs it, and subscribe to the channel. Your support keeps stories like this alive, and it reminds people they're not alone in choosing dignity over noise.